Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What's behind the U.S. pressure for Israel to change its scorched earth strategy in Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. In the Middle East, the Biden administration is exactly at the point where it never wanted to be. Literally 1 week before the Hamas attack of October 7th, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was saying, and quote, "The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades," unquote. Now it's round-the-clock crisis meetings and one top U.S. official after the other making trips to the region. After months of rejecting a full ceasefire, now American officials and some hardline European allies, like the UK and Germany, are hinting that they're not okay with the brutality of Israel's war. Israel's strategy has been to punish the civilian population of the Gaza Strip with maximum damage, killing and maiming tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians and turning Gaza into a place where no one can live. So what's behind the slight change in tune among Western powers? And what, if anything, will change in this war? Today, we're talking with Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group, a firm that studies geopolitical risk. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Look, I want our audience to know that one of the reasons you're famous in the world is for seeing crises coming around the corner, assessing and looking at geopolitical risk that is out there. But I want to read to you a statement made on the 29th of September by Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor. He said, "The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced." So I want to ask you, Ian, this was a week before October 7th and the Hamas attacks. What didn't Jake Sullivan see coming that you did see coming?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's recognize that many of the things that Jake was talking about a week before October 7th are still in place. The Abraham Accords, which helped facilitate Israel normalizing relations with countries around the region, and putting them in the best geopolitical position that they had been since independence of Israel, still very much in place. Secondly, a breakthrough that was facilitated by the Americans, a breakthrough facilitated by the Chinese between Iran and Saudi Arabia that nobody thought possible. That's still very much in place. In fact, it was after the October 7th terrorist attacks that Mohammed bin Salman and Iranian President Raisi spoke on the phone for the first time. And then Raisi traveled to the Saudi kingdom to meet with MBS and with many other Gulf leaders. So, I mean, the backdrop of the big powers in the Middle East being able to engage with each other and not be in a state of war, that was true before October 7th. That's true after October 7th. But of course, the piece of Jake's quote that really reads most problematically is, "I haven't had to spend any time on this compared to anything else." And since October 7th, he's been spending most of his time on it. And in fact, he's been on shuttle diplomacy back and forth to the region, just as the Secretary of Defense, just as the Secretary of State, even President Biden. So what went wrong? And what went wrong is that everyone, the Israelis and the Gulf allies and the Europeans and absolutely the Americans for years basically came to the conclusion of, well, we can't resolve Israel-Palestine, so we'll just stuff it in a box, and perhaps we'll even literally stuff the Palestinians in a box, and we'll make peace with the rest of the region, and we'll just keep on keeping on. And what we saw on October 7th is that doesn't work for the Palestinians, and they can make you pay for it. That's basically the singular piece that Jake is missing.
Is Israel going to be safer? Is it going to be able to take out Hamas? Is there stability down the road for Israel after what we've seen unfold?
Well, there's 2 reasons why they're not safer. One is that you can take out Hamas leadership and tunnels and command and control and fighters, but you will not, as a consequence, take out the ideas, the ideology that led to Hamas. In fact, you'll strengthen it. The Americans learned this over decades with the failed war on terror. You can take out bin Laden and all of his henchmen, but you can't take out the extremism. And you see the Taliban running Afghanistan yet again in Afghanistan. Today, if you ask Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank how they feel about Hamas, there is far more support for that group after October 7th and after 2 months of Israeli war than there was before October 7th. So that's one way that they're not safer. The second way they're not safer is they're losing international support. The Americans are more isolated in supporting Israel and opposing a ceasefire in the war today than the Russians were when they invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago. And you see that with the United Nations Security Council resolution and the General Assembly votes that have taken place. That's an astonishing thing to say. And in the United States, Biden is under a lot of pressure because a lot of his supporters, and especially young people, are increasingly sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, not with Israel. And indeed, in recent polls, astonishing to me, a majority of young Americans, Generation Z Americans, say that the attacks on October 7th, the terrorist attacks, were actually justified. So those are the two ways that Israel is not safer. But, Steve, I want to be very clear. You have a lot of people that are saying Israel is facing an existential threat, and that's not true either. Israel is in the strongest military position of any country in the region, a significant nuclear force, enormously well-trained and technologically advanced military, border, and surveillance capabilities, far more capacity to outgun and through Iron Dome to defend against missile attack in Israel than anybody else in the region. And it is true that October 7th showed the weaknesses of those defenses, especially if a government took its eye off the ball, as Netanyahu's did. But I've had so many lectures about how Israel is the best place to invest long-term in the Middle East for pension funds and institutional investors. And then the next hour, those same leaders saying Israel faces an existential threat. Both of those things cannot simultaneously be true. The former is and still is, and the latter is politically expedient. And we need to recognize that.
Well, let me play you a clip along those lines from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who had something to say about this crisis. Let's listen.
It would compound this tragedy if all that was waiting for the Israeli people and your Palestinian neighbors at the end of this awful war was more insecurity, fury, and despair.
And those are very sobering words from the United States Secretary of Defense about the neighborhood. You just talked about risk. You're one of the greatest risk calculators I know. Is Israel robbing itself in this moment of that AAA, gold star rating of, a relatively low risk investment for the rest of the world by not taking an off ramp to some of what we've seen? How is Israel playing with its future here?
Again, kind of less than you'd think, Steve. Again, because no one's going to take away the military support that the U.S. is providing. No one's going to take away the technological capabilities that Israel has. The people that are fighting against Israel, in the Palestinians in Hamas, are fighting from a position of desperation. The Israelis are defending from a position of strength, and they're also occupying from a position of strength. So no, I don't buy the idea that Israel is suddenly going to be existentially vulnerable to its enemies, not least because leaders in Saudi Arabia and the UAE quietly are perfectly happy to see Hamas be destroyed. They can't say it publicly. Hamas is a problem for them. The Arab Street is a problem for them. And Saudi Arabia would love to be in a position where they could once again normalize relations with Israel, as they were just about to do before October 7th. They just need it to be more than window dressing for the Palestinians, given what's happened for the last couple of months. So no, I don't buy that. But I do buy the fact that Israel is more isolated today and is losing some of its international support that has been hard fought over many decades. And look, I'm sympathetic to the fact that Israelis feel like they cannot live next to a territory that is run by a government that does not recognize their right to exist. I accept that. I accept that it cannot be sustainable for the Israeli government to live next to a Hamas-led Gaza. But that is very different than saying that they must destroy every member of Hamas that's ever picked up a rifle, that they must destroy every individual who has described loyalty or fealty to that organization. I don't think it is accomplishable. I think that the civilian costs have already been far too high as a consequence of their efforts to do that. And I think they will lose more than they gain from their own population and more broadly.
Do you think there's a way after this conflict subsides, and it will subside, it will end at some moment, where the Palestinian Authority or the PLO or some other entity that the United States helps engineer in place will be able to come in and govern Gaza, come in and govern the West Bank and move us forward? Or do you think that's a pipe dream?
Well, I mean, the idea of governing Gaza when it's rubble and more than 50% of the population without homes, you can't govern that. You have to rebuild that before you can govern it. You have to construct it. There has to be a state there. There's no state there right now. There's human carnage. So we're many, many months, probably years away from when you would be able to talk about governing 2.5 million people on the ground in Gaza. But it will need to happen, and it will need to happen with a plan for a sustainable future for the Palestinians. Israel has a right to defend itself under every circumstance. So do the Palestinians. The Israelis have a capacity to defend themselves. As of right now, the Palestinians do not. To do that, you need to have a government that doesn't want to destroy Israel and that also is capable of governing its people without corruption, without stealing all of the aid that's coming into them. That is not Hamas. Historically, that has not been the Palestinian Authority. They haven't done a very good job, but there's nobody else. Now, the Americans are saying they want the Palestinian Authority to provide some security, even if not governance, right? The Israelis under Netanyahu are saying no way, no how. I don't believe that Netanyahu is going to be there for much longer than another few months. So it's clear that you're not going to have that kind of a solution with him in charge, but nobody thinks he should be running Israel, not least the Israeli citizens. Once he's gone, yeah, I think that's part of a solution. I think Egypt can be part of a solution as well, with a lot of money provided by the Gulf states. But this, I think the United Nations can be part of that solution. But Steve, we are very, very far from that conversation.
You know, one of the things I've been wondering is, are we seeing an escalation without noticing it? You've recently written about the Houthis, drones that were shot down, 14 drones that were shot down, successful ballistic missile attacks from the Houthis on shipping in the Red Sea and coming out of the Suez Canal. And it is affecting the decision on how some commerce is traveling. Is there an Iran-backed escalation right now that we're not witnessing? Is this the Houthis basically taking independent action? And do you worry about that? Is that something, as I have to tell you, in Washington, there's not been a lot of reaction to this, but when you look at the detail of what the Houthis have been able to do, it's pretty significant in my book. What do you think?
Well, you asked me if there's Iran-backed escalation. I think the answer is yes. You did not ask me if there was Iran-orchestrated escalation. The answer to that would be no. And there's a very big gap between those two things, even if they are leading to the same outcome. Now, for the first 6 weeks of this war, the attacks we saw from the Houthis, as well as from Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, also backed by Iran, were considered by the Americans privately to be nuisance attacks. They weren't meant to kill soldiers. They weren't meant to really, sort of lead to any escalation. They were just kind of showing that these actors were there. They're powerful. They could cause problems in the future. You need to pay attention to them. And the American response was very restrained, targeted, one attack a week, also meant to not really kill anybody and certainly not get the Iranians directly involved. Since then, we have now seen, since the ceasefire, the humanitarian pause when the hostages were being exchanged, and now the attacks on Gaza have begun again in earnest, we have now seen a significant escalation from the Houthis in particular, who are attacking ships with the intention of destroying them and sustained attacks on American warships in the Red Sea. That has led some companies to stop shipping through that area and instead a much longer, much more expensive route around South Africa. And it's also led to more significant American responses, though focused so far on economic sanctions against some of those actors as opposed to military escalation. The Americans don't want the Iranians to get directly involved in this war. What we've seen from the Iranians so far is they're willing to keep the Houthis on a pretty long leash, but that's very different from, wanting to have this become a regional conflagration. So I'm like you, Steve. I'm more worried today about that trajectory than I was 3 weeks ago. But I still think it is less likely than more likely that we are, on the tipping point of a regional war.
Now you're seeing more and more direct calls by the administration for a change of game plan by the Israelis in Gaza. And I'm just wondering, and I asked this recently of Egypt's foreign minister, Sameh Shoukry, I said, is there a line that will trigger some different action from Egypt in the neighborhood? And he said, probably not, which means I'm wondering at what point we stop watching the horror of what's unfolding in Palestine and people begin putting consequences into their words.
Now, privately, the Israelis had told the Americans that they had learned lessons and that mistakes were made in the first weeks of the bombing campaign in the north of Gaza, and that was going to lead to restraint and a lot fewer civilian casualties. Well, the Biden administration doesn't buy that, at least from what they've seen so far. And Biden doesn't like or trust Netanyahu. Now, the Americans, it's not surprising. Israel is the top ally of the United States in the region, and they experienced the worst casualties, the worst attacks on the Jews that anyone had seen since the Holocaust. So it's not a surprise that the American response is, we're going to any criticism we have, we're going to make to you privately. We're not going to air dirty laundry against our friends publicly. And that also meant vetoes at the Security Council and carrying a lot of water for the Israelis in multilateral diplomacy with the Gulf states and with the Europeans and others. All of that has happened. But I want to bring you back, Steve, to 2015, when the same Netanyahu was in power in Israel. And the Obama administration with Biden were pushing for an Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And Netanyahu, who is the top ally of the United States in the Middle East, did not quietly tell Biden, here's what I really think you should do, and here's how we should work this, and I want to give you some advice. No, he flew to Washington. He gave a public speech to the House and the Senate, bipartisan, doing everything he could to sabotage, to torpedo the Iranian nuclear deal, gave interviews to American newspapers, same thing. Now, that is not the way you behave if you're the top ally of the United States in the region, especially when you're in a position of supplicant. It's not as if there's a power balance between Israel and the United States. And I think that Biden has had an entirely too soft gloves approach with Netanyahu. Biden is Israel's biggest friend, strongest friend, most committed friend for decades and decades. And he has been sitting there publicly watching Netanyahu destroy aspects of that position and that relationship in an election year in the United States.
Do you think that there is an opportunity there still down the road that the United States is hoping the Saudis, maybe other Abraham Accords members, are going to be the rebuilders of Gaza, the stakeholders in Gaza, or do you think they're going to stay on the sidelines like they've largely been doing?
I think the Saudis want to play more of a leadership role, and I think they have a much better relationship with the U.S. right now. In some ways, paradoxically, given the Chinese engagement, how much more energy they're buying as well, given what's happened between Israel and Hamas, still, the Saudis are very interested in a nuclear energy deal, civilian nuclear energy deal with the Americans that would also bring inspectors onto the ground into Saudi Arabia with a full fuel cycle, and that the Americans would provide them with major non-NATO ally status and ramp up the level of and technology of the weapon systems they're providing the Saudis. I think that deal is absolutely still doable. The question is Saudi normalization of relations with Israel a part of that deal? Right now, it can't be. With this Israeli government, it can't be. And with window dressing for the Palestinians, which would have been acceptable before the war, but that can't be. You need to have something much more substantive for the Palestinians, and the Saudis need to be part of it. It needs to be a lot more money and a lot more security and stability on the ground than that deal that was inked in Bahrain that was a sop for the Palestinians that allowed for the Abraham Accords in the first place under the Trump administration.
Let me ask you real quickly about David Cameron, now Foreign Minister of the UK, and Annalena Baerbock of Germany, Germany's foreign minister, are both pushing hard for a resumption of the deal-making around hostages. And a lot of us have been looking at the hostage politics in Israel and whether there's any dimension there. But more and more international calls to get back into that kind of deal-making with Qatar at the table, the Israelis, Hamas, et cetera. Where do you think that might go?
The French, the Germans, and the UK are now calling for a sustainable ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Not an immediate ceasefire, but a sustainable ceasefire. That is a different position from where the Americans are. It's very different from where the war went on Russia-Ukraine, where the U.S. was so aligned with all of NATO. Here, the U.S. is largely by itself, and the allies are taking a position that's more akin to what you see in the global South, frankly. They are also calling for the immediate release of all hostages. Everyone is saying that, but you've already released the hostages that were easy to release and were easy to negotiate for. When you're talking about men of fighting age, it's a lot harder, and then Hamas is going to drive a much tougher deal. Also, with Hamas getting blown up to a much greater degree, they increasingly see that the Israelis war cabinet is willing to go after them individually. Well, there's not as much reason for them to negotiate. It's kind of like the position that Yevgeny Prigozhin had when he finally decided to march on Moscow. It's not like that was a winning strategy, but he was kind of out of options, right? So, I mean, if you're Hamas right now, your willingness to negotiate, short of things that the Netanyahu government are completely unwilling to provide you, really, really limited. So you can call for this all you want, and there have been General Assembly resolutions that have demanded, overwhelming majorities demanding a ceasefire, but also the release of all hostages. Well, Israel's said no to one side, but Hamas has said very clear no to the other.
Well, we always get a straight scoop from Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the political risk consultancy, the Eurasia Group. Really, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to see you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? From America's perspective, Israel's future and security have sort of been dealt with as a sacred issue that couldn't be discussed with the same kind of give and take that, say, the security of Europe is discussed. That's one of the reasons why a state of Palestine or justice for Palestinians has been a third-rail topic in America for decades. But that may just be changing. The U.S. Defense Secretary is warning out loud that Israel may suffer strategic defeat, and young people in America are dismayed by what they're seeing, and they're promising to withhold support from President Joe Biden. This crisis is changing and affecting American politics. That doesn't mean the equation of U.S. support for Israel's structural indifference to Palestine changes tomorrow, but it does mean the equation is no longer cost-free. It means more Americans are paying attention, and the past belief that Palestine's future could be shoved out of view and under the rug is just no longer viable. Maybe, just maybe, a different world is shaping up. And that's the bottom line.